They laughed for the last time in their lives when they heard the word gravity next to Earth. None of them knew that in 7 minutes, the metal deck beneath their feet would crack like an eggshell, and the silence that followed would be louder than any scream. None of them knew that the man they had called fragile, underdeveloped, a product of a weak world, was now standing in the cargo hold 2 decks below, slowly, calmly, and wordlessly removing his gloves. It all started with a simple taunt. The kind heard in every barracks, every military station, every corner of the galaxy where different species meet. Usually, such taunts are forgotten within an hour. But not this time. The station was called Cassiopeia 9, a staging base for the United Fleet, orbiting a neutral system where recruits from dozens of races flocked before being assigned to combat squadrons. Here, those destined to become part of the interstellar forces were trained. Here, the weak were broken and the strong were forged. And here, at the very end of the recruit barracks corridor, sat a man named Artyom Volkov, the only representative of Earth in a stream of 230 cadets. He wasn't tall. He wasn't particularly broad-shouldered. Compared to the 3-meter-tall centaurids from Garan or the armored, chitinous skintrax, he looked almost comical, small, thin, with the tired eyes of a man who hadn't slept for too long. That's how they saw him on his first day, and that first impression would seal his fate for the coming weeks. Earth, muttered Instructor Vorin, a member of the Kasserite race, looking at the recruit's personal file with ill-concealed contempt. A planet with gravity at 98% of standard. Weak gravity. Weak species. How did you even pass the selection? The Kasserites were a race proud of their physical strength. Their homeworld had gravity 1.5 times higher than normal, and every Kasserite, upon arriving on other planets, felt like a deity among ants. Vorin was precisely the 2 meters 40 centimeters of solid muscle and disdain, an instructor with a reputation for breaking more recruits than anyone else on the station. "We are proud of what we have, sir," Artyom answered quietly. A wave of laughter swept through the barracks. Not a malicious laugh, but a condescending one. The kind of laugh adults make fun of a child who said something naive. Proud? Vorin circled him like a predator studying its prey. Your species evolved in a world where even your own skeleton doesn't provide enough weight. Your muscles are mere threads compared to any serious species in this room. I've seen drag cubs stronger than a full-grown human. Maybe, said Artyom, without looking up. Not maybe. Definitely, Vorin snapped. And that's why I'm exempting you from the strength requirements for the first week. No need to humiliate yourself in front of everyone else. It was worse than any insult. Being exempt from the norms meant one thing: you weren't considered worthy of even trying. Artyom remained silent. He always remained silent when he was underestimated. Silence gave him what words never gave him: time. As the days passed, the ridicule continued, growing into details, legends, and jokes that were passed from mouth to mouth throughout the station. Have you heard about the man from Earth? They say he can't even lift his own backpack. Their gravity is so weak that even the leaves fall from the trees slowly, like feathers. Earthlings are the only species that send their weakest members into space because there's no one to protect them back home anyway. Artyom heard every joke. He trained alone, late at night, when the training hall was empty. He lifted weights no one knew about. He ran through the station's corridors at hours when the lighting systems switched to night mode and most of the cadets were asleep. He trained, not to prove anything, but because he knew that sooner or later there would come a time when words would cease to matter, and only what you could do would matter. The only one who treated him without disdain was a girl named Liana, a Vatarian, slender, with silvery skin and eyes the color of a stormy ocean. Vatarians were renowned not for strength, but for intelligence. They were a race of scientists, strategists, and engineers. Perhaps that's why Liana viewed people differently than others. Why don't you answer them? She asked one evening, finding him silently wrapping bandages around his hands in the empty training room. Answering with words is a waste of time, Artyom said. Words don't change what people, that is, members of species, think. They only change actions. Can you really do what they whisper you can't? She asked with the genuine curiosity of a scientist, not mockery. Artyom looked at her for a long moment. Earth's gravity isn't weak, he said quietly. It would be weak if we lived in it our entire lives without resistance. But the human body didn't evolve just for gravity. It evolved for pressure. For strain. For millions of years of struggling to survive in a world where everything, from the climate to predators, was trying to kill us. Gravity is just one parameter. There are parameters they don't measure. Lyanna frowned, considering his words with the seriousness with which her race treated all data. What parameters? The endurance of the nervous system under pain. The ability of muscle fibers to withstand overload beyond their nominal value. Bone density adapted to impact loads, not just static weight. He tightened the bandage around his knuckles. Your devices measure muscle strength at rest. They don't measure what the human body is capable of when adrenaline rewrites all the rules. She was silent for a long time. Then why do you let them think differently? Because an underestimated man is the most dangerous man in the room, he replied, and for the first time in his voice there was something like steel. The ridicule reached its peak in the fourth week, when Station Command announced a demonstration exercise, a test of a new type of combat deck developed for landing ships with enhanced gravity compensation. The deck was constructed of tidronium alloy, a material used in the armor of flagships, a material capable of withstanding a direct hit from a plasma cannon. The test was intended to demonstrate to the cadets how high-gravity species prepare for landing operations on planets with extreme conditions. Voron volunteered to conduct the demonstration personally. Look closely, he announced to the 200 cadets gathered in the hangar around a tidronium alloy platform raised 3 meters above the floor. This deck can withstand a 20-ton drop from a height of 50 meters without a single crack. This is the standard you should strive for. A strength unattainable by. He looked directly at Artyom, who stood in the back row, some species. He leaped 3 meters onto the platform, a spectacular leap that showcased the might of his cassiterite musculature. The deck withstood the impact without a single mark. The crowd roared its approval. Anyone want to try? Voron asked mockingly, looking around the ranks of cadets. No one volunteered, not because they were afraid, but because everyone knew that no species other than the casserites and the Drakas were physically capable of generating such a shock wave. I want to try, Artyom said. The laughter in the hangar was so loud it echoed off the metal walls. Voron smiled, not a kind smile. The man wants to try, he said, drawing out the words with relish. Good. Let's see how Earth's weak gravity handles a real load. Artyom climbed onto the jump platform, the same height, 3 meters. 230 cadets watched him. Some laughed openly. Some filmed the proceedings for amusement. Lyanna stood in the front row, not laughing. She saw in his eyes something the others didn't. Calm. Not bravado. Not despair. Calculation. He removed the top of his uniform, leaving behind a training vest, and everyone saw what the baggy cadet clothes had concealed, not a mountain of muscles like those of the casserites, but a dense, sinewy body, covered with a network of scars and a relief that spoke of years of hidden, merciless work on himself. 3 meters isn't much, he said quietly, looking down at the tidronium deck. But it should be enough. He jumped. What happened next divided the history of Cassiopeia 9 into before and after. The sound of the impact was unlike anything anyone present had heard before. Not the dull thud of landing. A crack. A sharp, air-shattering sound of splintering metal, followed by a wave of vibration that rolled across the entire hangar floor and caused the standing cadets to stagger. The tidronium deck, a material capable of supporting 20 tons from a height of 50 meters, cracked under the feet of the man they called weak. The crack spread from the point of impact like a spider web across glass, reaching the edges of the platform in a split second. The piece of alloy, which had withstood the direct impact of the casserite leap without a single mark, now hung shattered, its edges ragged, exposing the material's inner structure. Silence fell in the hangar. Absolute, deafening silence, the silence of 230 beings whose brains refused to process what they had just seen. Artyom stood on the broken platform, his knees slightly bent, his hands still in the landing position. He raised his head and looked at Voron, not with triumph, not with malice. With absolute calm. "I apologize for the deck," he said. "Next time, warn me in advance if you want me to calculate the force of the blow more accurately." No one laughed. No one moved. Even the air seemed frozen. Voron stood, looking at the shattered platform, and something within his understanding of the world was cracking, just as the tidronium alloy beneath a man's feet had cracked. Everything he believed in the superiority of force, the hierarchy of species, the idea that the gravity of one's homeworld determines a being's worth, all of it was crumbling before his eyes. "How?" he began and stopped, unable to find the words. "Do you want to know how?" Artyom asked, descending the wreckage of the platform with a slow, measured step. "Then listen, because I'll only explain it once." He approached the center of the hangar, where Voron had stood triumphant just a moment ago. Now the power dynamic in the room had shifted without a single blow, without a single aggressive gesture, simply by the fact of what had happened. "You're right about one thing," Artyom began, addressing not Voron but all 230 cadets at once. His voice, usually quiet, now carried throughout the hangar with the force that comes with absolute truth. "Earth's gravity is indeed 98% of the galactic standard. That's true. But it's also true that you've never asked yourself why the human body developed such bone density and such explosive muscle strength if the gravity of our world is so gentle?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "The answer is simple. Gravity isn't the only force that shapes the body. There's another force, one your biology textbooks don't mention because your species has never encountered it to the same degree as we have. This force is called struggle." He glanced at the rows of cadets. "Earth is not a gentle world. Earth is a world that, for millions of years, tried to kill every species that appeared on it. Ice ages that wiped out entire ecosystems. Predators whose jaws could crush bone with a single bite. Starvation that forced only those whose bodies could work at the limit for weeks without rest to survive. We did not evolve for a comfortable life in gentle gravity. We evolved to survive despite everything that tried to wipe us off the face of the planet." One of the cadets, a Drac named Tress, raised his hand, a gesture rare among his race, which was accustomed to asserting rather than questioning. "But muscle mass is determined by physics," he said. "Mass can't just appear out of nowhere." "Correct," Artyom nodded. "And I have less muscle mass than any Draka in this room." "It's not about mass. It's about how that mass is used. Your bodies are optimized for constant, sustained force. You can carry heavy weights for long periods of time. Our bodies are optimized for explosive, short-term force, because in the wild on Earth, the difference between life and death was often measured in fractions of a second. It wasn't a question of how much can you carry, but how quickly can you react without being eaten." He looked at the broken platform behind him. A 3-meter jump creates an impact load that depends not on static force, but on the ability of the muscles and tendons to absorb and instantly redirect kinetic energy upon landing. Your instructors train you to lift. No one trained me to lift. Evolution trained me to survive the moment when it's too late to lift, and you just need to be fast enough and tough enough to stay on your feet when everything else falls. Voron finally found his voice, although it no longer had the same confidence. "It's impossible to calculate in advance. No device has ever demonstrated such potential in your medical field." "Because you measured me at rest," Artyom replied quietly. "You've never measured what happens to a person when they decide they must do something. Our bodies aren't just strong. They're stubborn. And stubbornness is something no instrument in your galaxy has learned to measure." The silence in the hangar changed, no longer the silence of shock, but the silence of realization. Liana, standing in the front row, looked at him the way a scientist looks at data that completely overturns established theory. But the story didn't end that evening in the hangar. It was just beginning. News of the damaged hydronium deck spread across the station faster than the solar wind. By the next morning, all of Cassiopeia 9 knew about the incident, and the day after that, the entire Combined Fleet Command Sector. Surveillance footage, normally reserved for reporting purposes, somehow leaked into the station's shared network and was distributed to every barracks terminal. The reaction was mixed. Some cadets began to regard Artyom with a new, awkward respect, a respect tinged with fear of something they didn't understand. Others, especially among the Cassarites, took the incident as a personal affront, a crack in the very foundation of their sense of superiority. 3 days later, the station's commander, Admiral Kresorin, a member of the ancient and respected Nellisterian humanoid race known for their impartiality and strategic thinking, called Artyom into his office. The Admiral's office was on the station's upper deck, with a transparent dome offering a view of the stars and the slowly rotating disk of the planet below. Oren was an old man by the standards of his race, with silvered hair and eyes that had seen more than one war. "Cadet Volkov," he said when Artyom entered and stood at attention. "Do you know what you've done?" "I damaged the deck, sir," Artyom replied evenly. "I'm prepared to pay compensation or accept any disciplinary action." Oren chuckled, the dry, short laugh of a man who had long since ceased to be surprised by the absurdity of bureaucracy. "Disciplinary action? Cadet, you just forced the Combined Fleet Command to revise the tactical landing protocols for an entire sector of space." Artyom blinked in surprise. For the first time in the entire conversation, his calm had cracked. "Sir?" "The hydronium alloy you shattered was used in the design of armored decks for heavy assault ships precisely because we considered a Cassarite strike to be the maximum shock load that could be sustained in real combat conditions," Oren said, rising from his desk and approaching the transparent dome. "We never considered human physiology as a source of significant shock force because your static strength values are in the lower third of galactic standards." He turned to Artyom, and there was something in his gaze that Artyom had never seen from representatives of other species, genuine curiosity, devoid of contempt. "Tell me, cadet. Not as a soldier to a commander. As one sentient being to another. What is your species hiding from the rest of the galaxy?" Artyom was silent, weighing his words. "We're not deliberately hiding anything, sir," he said finally. "It's just that no one's ever asked the right questions. Earth sent its first representatives into space only a few decades ago, by galactic standards. We're still new here. And newcomers tend to be underestimated, that's natural. The problem is, the galaxy judges us by parameters that are important for established, stable worlds. Our world has never been stable. Each generation of people has struggled just to ensure the next generation survives. That leaves a mark, sir. Not in the instruments. In something deeper." Oren was silent for a long time, looking at the stars beyond the dome. "You know, cadet, in my 312 years of service in the Navy, I've seen many species come to us with pride and claims of superiority. The Draki pride themselves on their endurance. The Cassarites on their brute strength. The Vaterians on their intellect. But no species before yours has ever come to us hiding their true strength behind a mask of weakness." "We don't hide our strength intentionally, sir," Artyom repeated quietly. "We're simply accustomed to being underestimated. And we've learned to use it. That," Oren said with a slight smile, "is the most dangerous character trait I've ever encountered in an intelligent species. A species that allows itself to be deliberately underestimated because it knows underestimation is a weapon." From that day on, everything on Cassiopeia 9 began to change. Instructor Vorin, who had been shaken out of his usual rut of arrogance by the incident more than anyone else, began showing up in the training room during the same late hours as Artyom's training, not to mock, but to observe. To watch the man he despised lift weights that seemed impossible for his build, not because his body was built for it, but because his mind refused to accept the word impossible. "Why do you train alone, at night, when no one can see?" Vorin asked one day, standing in the doorway of the empty hall, his voice, for the first time, sounding without its previous contempt. Artyom lowered the barbell, wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at his former tormentor with a long, appraising gaze. "Because strength that's only seen for show is theater," he said. "Real strength is the kind you develop when no one's watching, because you need it not for applause, but for the moment when everything else collapses and you have to stay on your feet." Voron was silent for a long time, pondering these words with the seriousness with which the Cassarites treated questions of strength and honor. "On my home planet," he said finally, "there is a saying, he who shows strength without reason fears it will not be there when needed. He who hides strength without reason knows it will always be there." I thought that saying was about us, the Cassarites. Perhaps I was wrong. Weeks passed. Artyom continued training, continued to remain silent more than he spoke, and continued to astonish the station with new demonstrations of what the galaxy had come to consider impossible for a weak species. But the true test came not in the training hall or during demonstration exercises. It came when the Cassiopeia 9 station received a distress signal. A transport ship carrying civilian refugees from a frontier colony under attack by pirate raiders crashed in orbit around a neighboring planet, a world with gravity 2.5 times higher than standard, a world considered unsuitable for rescue operations by all but the most massive and physically resilient species in the galaxy. The rescue team had to be composed of creatures capable of functioning in extreme gravity long enough to evacuate survivors from a ship that had crashed on the surface. Despite their strength, the Cassarites would lose consciousness if exposed to gravity greater than 2x. Their cardiovascular systems, optimized for 1.5x gravity, couldn't withstand such a strain for the hours required for a rescue operation. The Draki were resilient enough, but their chitinous exoskeleton slowed their movements so much that it made rescue technically challenging. "We need volunteers capable of withstanding 2.5 Gs for at least 4 hours without losing consciousness and maintaining full functionality," Admiral Oren announced at an emergency station command meeting. "Medical data indicates that none of our current species meets these requirements with a sufficient safety margin." "May I volunteer, sir?" Artyom said, rising from his seat. Oren looked at him with a long, searching gaze. "Cadet, extrapolating from your previous demonstrations, I suspect human physiology can handle this kind of stress better than standard metrics suggest. But this isn't a training ground. This is a real rescue mission with real lives at stake, including your own. Do you understand the risk?" "I understand, sir," Artyom replied evenly. "And I'm ready to accept it." The escape pod carrying Artyom and 2 other volunteers, the Vaterian Liana, whose race, despite its fragile constitution, possessed a unique nervous resistance to overload thanks to its biochemistry, and the young Draka Tress, who volunteered against the protests of his command, entered the planet's atmosphere in a tense silence. Gravity hit his body the moment the capsule touched the surface. Artyom felt every cell in his body suddenly weigh 2.5 times more, his chest compressed under its own weight, and the blood rushed to his feet faster than ever, causing dizziness and blurred vision. "Hold on," he croaked, feeling his body, trained for years, begin to adapt, slowing his pulse, redistributing blood flow, forcing every muscle to work not at its limit, but with the long haul in mind. "Breathe slowly. Don't fight the weight. Work with it." The wreck of the transport ship lay 300 meters from the landing point, a huge, twisted mass of metal, smoking against the crimson sky of the alien planet. According to the ship's last signals, 47 survivors remained inside, including children, trapped in compartments that could collapse at any moment under their own weight in the anomalous gravity. The next 4 hours became an ordeal that defied description in words, an ordeal where every movement required an effort unimaginable under normal conditions, where every step felt like climbing a steep flight of stairs with a load on your back, where even breathing became a conscious, laborious effort. Liana was the first to begin losing consciousness after 2 hours. Her Vaterian physiology, despite its resistance to G-forces, wasn't designed for such a prolonged period of stress. Artyom caught her limp body with one hand, continuing to clear away the debris blocking the entrance to one of the survivor compartments. "Tress, take her to the capsule," he ordered, and there was no hint of panic in his voice, only the focused determination of a man who had long ago accepted that panic was a luxury that could not be afforded in a critical moment. Drak, his chitinous shell creaking under the strain of the unfamiliar gravity, nodded and dragged Liana toward the capsule, leaving Artyom alone to continue the rescue operation. He worked alone for the next 2 hours, pulling survivors one by one from the ship's twisted hull, his muscles aching, his lungs straining under the weight, his vision blurring from the lack of oxygen in his overburdened circulatory system. But he didn't stop. Every time his body screamed at him to stop, something deeper than physiology compelled him to take another step, lift another piece of debris, pull another child from the rubble. As he pulled out the last survivor, a little girl from a border colony, her eyes wide with terror, her hands clutching a broken toy, his own body finally began to fail. His legs trembled. His vision blurred. But he carried her to the capsule in his arms, step by step, each step potentially his last, and handed her over to the medical team a second before his own consciousness began to fade. He woke up in the station's medical bay 3 days later, his body aching like it had never ached before, but he was alive, and all 47 survivors from the transport ship were alive because of him. Admiral Oren visited him personally, standing at his bunk with an expression on his face that Artyom had never seen before on any other species. "Cadet Volkov," he said quietly. "The medical data from that operation is currently being studied by the best physiologists in the United Fleet. You spent 4 hours and 14 minutes in a gravity environment that should have destroyed your body within 90 minutes, according to all known models of human physiology. Your models probably need updating, sir," Artyom smiled weakly. "Yes," Oren nodded, his voice unusually warm. "They need it. You know, cadet, in all my years of service I've learned one truth about intelligent species: true strength cannot be measured by instruments. It can only be seen at the moment when everything else collapses, yet the being still stands. You've shown the galaxy something it's forgotten, if it ever knew it at all, that strength is born not from comfort, but from struggle. And your species, cadet, has fought longer and harder than any of us can imagine." News of the rescue operation spread throughout the entire United Fleet sector, outpacing even the story of the wrecked deck. For the first time in Earth's decades of membership in the galactic community, humans were no longer mere newcomers, tolerated out of politeness and underestimated out of habit. They had become a species spoken of with cautious, growing respect. Voren, the instructor whose contempt had once been so deep, came to Artyom on the last day before graduation, when the recruits were preparing to be assigned to the combat squadrons of the United Fleet. "Cadet Volkov," he said, standing at attention, and for the first time there was not a drop of contempt in his voice. "I owe you an apology. I judged your species by parameters that were irrelevant. I saw weakness where there was hidden strength. And I want you to know, from this day forward, if a Casserite on any station in the galaxy ever utters the word low gravity in relation to Earth, I will tell them the story of the man who shattered a Tidronium deck and rescued 47 lives from the gravity collapse that should have killed him." Artyom extended his hand, and Voren, for the first time shaking someone's hand with respect rather than condescension, squeezed it firmly. "It's not about proving superiority," Artyom said quietly. "We never wanted to be better than anyone. We just wanted to stop underestimating us before they learned the truth." Liana, standing next to him, smiled truly widely for the first time in the entire course. "You know," she said, "Batarian scientists are now engaged in a heated debate about revising the entire model of classifying species based on physical potential. Your species didn't just break the Tidronium deck, Artyom. You broke the paradigm the entire galaxy had trusted for millennia." The graduation ceremony took place beneath the dome of Cassiopeia 9, amidst stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless empires, countless visions of strength and weakness. 230 cadets stood in formation, ready to depart for the far reaches of the galaxy to serve in the combined fleet. But one of them stood differently than he had on his first day, not because he had grown taller or broader in stature, but because the entire galaxy around him had finally begun to see what he had known about himself all along. Admiral Oren, addressing the graduates in his final speech, uttered words that would later spread throughout the combined fleet network, quoted thousands of times in reports, lectures, and stories passed from instructor to instructor on dozens of stations across the galaxy. "We measure strength with instruments because instruments don't lie or exaggerate," he said, looking at the line of cadets, but seemingly addressing the man standing in the third row. But there is one kind of strength that no instrument in the known universe can measure, the strength of spirit that refuses to acknowledge its own limitations. Today, I want each of you to remember, the true danger of underestimation isn't that you underestimate your enemy. It's that you can underestimate a friend, an ally, a comrade in arms, simply because their strength is hidden behind the mask they choose to wear. He looked straight at Artyom. Earth didn't send us a weak species with soft gravity. Earth sent us a species that spent millennia learning to turn every obstacle into strength, every struggle into fortitude, every underestimation into an advantage. And today, here on Cassiopeia 9, we witnessed more than just the cracking of the Tidronium deck. The galaxy's very notion of what it means to be strong cracked. Artyom Volkov departed Cassiopeia 9 station a week later, heading to his new assignment with the United Fleet's battle squadron. Behind him lay a story that would be told for years to come, a story of a man called weak, and of a deck that cracked under the weight of a truth too long hidden behind ridicule and prejudice. But for Artyom himself, this was never a story about proving superiority. It was a story about patience. About a silence that accumulated strength instead of wasting it on arguments. About a people who learned to deliberately underestimate because they knew that when the truth finally broke out, it would speak louder than any words, louder than any scream, louder than even the crack of Tidronium alloy beneath the feet of a man whom no one in the entire galaxy would ever again call weak. Because somewhere out there, among trillions of stars and thousands of intelligent species, a simple yet irrefutable truth, born that evening in the hangar of Cassiopeia 9, has been unleashed. Earth's gravity may be 98% of the galactic standard. But the spirit of a person born on this planet defies any standard at all.